Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome, and thank you all for participating in Columbia's Center on Global Energy Policy webinar series on environmental justice, energy, and housing. I'm Richard Kaufman, Adjunct Senior Research Scholar at the Center. This event is being webcast live, and the full video will be available online in the coming days. There's a lot to talk about in energy and housing. And first, when we talk about housing, it's not about the building. It's about the people who live there. We know that people who live in under-resourced areas pay a higher proportion of their incomes on energy. We know that they live in places that are uncomfortable and unhealthy. Landlords don't have incentive to improve conditions. We also know that there are inequities in access to newer energy technologies such as solar because people are renters or have poor quality roofs or face constraints in financing. And COVID is making everything worse. On this panel, we want to delve into these problems. We want to talk about policies, federal, state, and local that don't work, and policies that do work. We want to talk about the different actors that can help address the problem and those that stand in the way. And also what the relevant role should be for government, for NGOs and community groups, and for the private sector. We have an outstanding panel of experts who've been on the front line to lead us through these topics. So I'll just quickly introduce them. Ariel Drehobel, who's Local Policy Manager, Energy Equity, American Council for an Energy Efficiency Economy. Sage Green, Technical Project Officer on the State Energy Planning Team in the Office of Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy at the U.S. Department of Energy. And John Washington, People's Action Homes Guarantee Organizer. So the format, each member of the panel will give about 5 minutes or so on their take on the problem. We'll then have a moderated discussion, and then we'll have time for audience questions. And we certainly welcome your questions. And for those of you that are joining via Zoom, you can submit a question for the panelists at any time by clicking on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. And for those of you watching the live stream anywhere else, you can submit questions via Twitter using the hashtag CJEPLive and our Twitter handle at ColumbiaUEnergy. So Ariel, let's start with you.
Great. Thank you so much for inviting me to speak today. And it's great to see so many people watching this broadcast. So to start, I'll give a little bit more background on the work that I do. I work at the American Council for an Energy Efficient Economy, which is a nonprofit research-based organization located in Washington, D.C. that does research on energy efficiency across all sectors of the economy. In particular, I work on the local policy team at ACEEE, and a lot of the work that I do is around advancing energy efficient solutions in cities, as well as working with utilities on low-income energy efficiency program best practices. And I also lead a lot of ACEE's work around energy justice and energy equity, which I'll talk a bit more about today. I think for this conversation, I like to set the stage in terms of framing things around energy insecurity, which is the term that I like to focus on in the research that I do and in the policy work that I do. And energy insecurity is the inability for households to adequately meet household heating, cooling, and energy needs over time. And I think to start off too, it's important when thinking about the causes of energy insecurity and why people may have difficulty meeting basic energy needs, it's important to acknowledge the historic and current policies at the federal, state, and local levels that have led to underinvestment and social and economic exclusion in low-income communities, in Black, Hispanic, and other communities of color that have led to a lot of these communities living in less efficient homes and therefore being impacted by disproportionate burdens on energy costs. And just for some examples of some of these policies, some of these are things like redlining, lack of accesses to mortgages and other loans, mass incarceration, employment discrimination, underfunding of schools, et cetera. So I just want to set the stage with those, justice issues in mind. And to move on to a bit more about work that I've done at ACEEE, I've worked on a few different reports looking at energy burdens, which is one metric that can be used to measure energy insecurity or energy insecurity, which measures the percentage of income that's spent on household energy bills. So after I give my remarks, I'll send in the chat a link to this new report that I did for people who are interested, where we looked at energy burdens nationally, regionally, and in 25 metro areas. This came out last month. And from this research, we found that energy insecurity is a persistent national challenge, with a quarter of all households in the US paying more than 6% of their income on energy bills, and 13% paying more than 10%, which is a lot of money to be spent just on energy bills. And we found that low-income households are spending 3 times more of their income than other households on energy costs. And compared to non-Hispanic white households, we found that the median energy burden for Black households was 43% higher, the median for Hispanic households was 20% higher, and the median for Native American households was 45% higher. So this research is just one example that shows the disproportionate cost burdens, energy cost burdens that are placed on households due to a number of policy reasons, lack of investment, and there are a lot of policy solutions that can work to address this. In the minute or so that I have left, I also want to highlight the importance right now of addressing unpaid energy bills and the ending bill moratoriums nationally. So as everyone knows, COVID-19 has had a tremendous impact on energy affordability, as 40 million Americans have filed for unemployment since the start of the pandemic. And there was a study by, the Electric Power Research Institute from April, so months ago, that found that more than 1/4 of households who had lost their jobs reported skipping utility bill payment. And we've seen not a whole lot of data collected on this to date in terms of what these unpaid bills look like. But a lot of states are beginning to lift the protections that they've had in place to keep people's electricity on in the short term. That's definitely something I'm concerned about and would be glad to talk more about, as well as other national and local solutions to addressing these disparities. And I'll end by saying, so I work a lot on energy efficiency policy, and I do see energy efficiency as a long-term solution to helping address some of these inequities by reducing these high energy burdens for households. And I see energy efficiency as well as a strategy that can complement bill payment assistance right now to help lower energy bills for households while also leading to more resilient and healthy communities in the long term. And through that new research, we found that on average, weatherization could reduce high energy bills by about 25%. And this investment would really help, I think, address energy burdens while also benefiting the environment and improving economic recovery right now. So definitely looking forward to more conversation. Would love to talk about solutions, especially at the local level, especially with utilities, in terms of how to address some of these disparities that we're seeing in the sector.
Okay, well, that's great. You set the stage very well. I've got a number of follow-up questions for you. So, John, let's go to you next.
Sure. So my name is John Washington. I'm a Homes Guarantee organizer with People's Action Now. Worked at Push Buffalo for about 6 years, working on campaigns, around economic development. Was one of the first organizers on the New York Renews campaign, which won last year, and did a lot of work around banking and just the financialization of property. And I think that the major problem that we have is the way that we look at the problem, and the fact that the way that we look at the problem gets us to solve the wrong problems. The reality is we have a society and social structures that produce these outcomes. They are not problems and challenges, they are products of a process. And the reality is that process is designed to produce apartheid. And that's fractal, it's differential between race, class, gender, and other dynamics. But the reality of the world that we live in today is that our system produces ghettos. Our system produces entirely different housing systems for different types of people, entirely different political systems for different types of people. And the number one problem that we have is there are not enough people like me in rooms like this and in conversations like this, even with my relative privilege. The people who are experiencing the problems and who understand that they are the result of this process are not the ones who are trying to understand it and communicating with the people who are trying to understand it and address it. And really the only way to address it is to start to change some of these relationships. So while weatherization in and of itself is a good thing, people need to start to look through things through the lens of power. And when you have privilege and you're not impacted in the same way by power, it is hard for you to understand how power operates. So we have a political system that is built on corruption. It is built on deferring to the largest corporate interests, and it is built by actually organizing people in these neighborhoods you talk about to accept their oppression and to cut deals around the existence of their oppression and how it relates to them. There are never enough resources put toward a problem to solve it. There is not enough thought put into the actual results. And we need the similar obsession that Jeff Bezos has to the end user. So in weatherization programs, what ultimately happens is the value of a home increases because of the investment. And when the value of a home increases because of the investment, that increases the taxes, that changes its relationship to the mortgage, it changes the value of the community. And the reality is our society is structured to produce gentrification. And my biggest fear in this moment, when the Biden administration and others are talking about putting trillions of dollars into weatherization, is the people who ultimately will end up on the streets because their home was weatherized, is the investors who are going to make enormous amounts of money through the process of weatherization that is being looked at completely separate from the actual human beings who are receiving the weatherization and what actually benefits them. And the truth is we continue in public policy to dump money onto this system of apartheid. And what happens is that means that essentially white people with privilege, with education, with technical skills get paid to create more problems for people of color in these neighborhoods that have been given no financial infrastructure to be able to hold the wealth that is funneled through their communities under this guise of improvement. And so I think what really has to start happening is organizations and institutions like the ones who are holding this conversation need to start looking at the material dynamics in the communities that they want to support. They need to start to get to know and get deeply involved and engaged in the intersectionality of these problems because they are not all individual. And we should not be talking about weatherization until we have just cause eviction and we give tenants the power and the ability to withstand what will happen when their homes are invested in. We cannot talk about weatherization without thinking about how it affects the financialization of housing, which affects every person's ability to stay in their home and to actually enjoy the results of this. So when we see this as a big over-the-top problem of how do we reduce emissions, how do we deal with these things that are, again, creating climate change and affecting the planet, we often, in these circles, do not look at the social infrastructure on the ground in the places that people, quote unquote, want to help and actually understand, one, what do people actually want? Two, what are the impacts of delivering any kind of service? And three, what is the existing infrastructure? So if you give money to a municipality, what is that municipality going to do with it? How does it operate politically? And, people often complain about the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party is a fractal representation of smaller Democratic parties. And often so much of our public policy is about producing jobs for patronage systems, is about directing resources to communities that ultimately are taken advantage of by the political system. And this is all born out of not having an actual analysis of power. Right? And power affects everything that we do, especially in communities of color, especially in communities that are set up to, again, produce these outcomes and these results that then we come in and try to fix without affecting those dynamics. So I think my goal and the goal of our Homes Guarantee campaign is to figure out how to decommodify housing, is to actually look at all of the financial relationships and how do we work with people on the ground in public housing, people who have faced eviction and are trying to build up a tenants' rights system that actually does the job of separating the relationship a person has to their housing and the amount of money that they make. And I think those are the types of problems that have to be baked into any level of problem solving on these issues. And that's where we really need to start. And then these more technical aspects of studying and understanding the problem. No one understands the problem better than the people who are experiencing it, and no one can make the connections to systems that those who look at this through a scientific lens may be completely unaware exist. So ultimately, I do believe that these problems will be solved, that they can be solved, but I think we really have to take a step back and go a step down on the ground with the folks who are experiencing this and figure out how do we create the best outcomes for those individuals, and how do we shift the way that structures work, so that we can produce the outcomes we want, but we cannot continue to analyze and study data and then go into communities with amounts of money that fix the physical problems without fixing the social problems.
All right, so John, I've spent enough time with you to understand what you mean by financialization of property. But if you can just say one sentence with what you mean by that.
In one sentence, it means that every piece of property is a commodity for someone. It is being sold in exchange for someone, whether you think you own it or not. And anything that you do to property affects those financial relationships. And if you ignore the relationship to the person and the relationship to the bank and the market, then ultimately you will produce gentrification. And that was not one sentence, but
It's kind of it's a sentence that's like Proust would write a sentence. That's good. Okay, so Sage.
Yeah, hello everyone. So my name is Sage Green. I'm going to tell you a little bit about myself and then also give you a title disclaimer for today. But first, I just want to say thanks so much for having me today. It's great to talk to everyone at Columbia. Ariel, I was just quoting your most recent study in some of my work, so it's cool to see your face. And John, I've known you forever, so it's good to see your face always. And Richard, I really appreciate how much you've committed to staying in touch with the people who you've met on the ground and doing this work. So thanks for putting this together. So a little bit about me. My name's Sage. I am a Buffalonian, so I'm from Buffalo, New York. I grew up here and I came to the energy efficiency and renewable energy work about 6 years ago, and I've been working in it ever since. So when I started, I was like many youth today who have grown up in a world that a lot of the questions of how did we get here or why was my circumstance the way that it was felt unanswered by our current education systems, by my parents, by my community. There were just things that we didn't talk about. And so I ended up going away to college to study urban studies because I thought that that was what was going to answer my questions. I dabbled in architecture, and it turns out that at the end of the day, what I was really most fascinated by was energy efficiency and housing insecurity, because those are the things that I experienced as a child. And so I am really grateful to organizers like John and organizers all over this city, as well as cities all over the country, who've paved the way for people like me who have experienced the issues to then learn and grow and be part of the solutions on the other side, both because it's an incredible way to create a career or to just build your life and answer the questions that we deserve to have answered. But also I think it makes the process way better when people who have experienced the problems are part of the solutions, like John talked about. So I grew up with 5 siblings under the poverty line, like 50% of my childhood peers in Buffalo. I grew up in old falling down houses in the city, as well as in local rural areas. And the issues of poverty, while they can seem incredibly easy to put into a sentence format or to have statistics for, and I think we've done a ton of work recently to make the statistics of the experience of energy insecurity or housing insecurity very clear. I think Ariel's recent study is one that I really appreciate for the way that you broke down urban versus rural versus different geographical territories. But at the end of the day, the statistics never really tell the whole story. And these issues are deeply intersectional and require complex solutions. So that's a little bit of my personal background. Professionally, after I wandered into a Push Buffalo meeting at 22 and started being part of a rate case meeting for the first time, in which I got to give comments to public officials and regulators about how to implement funds that had come down to fund weatherization in New York State. I became an energy auditor. So I trained in Push Buffalo's hiring hall for about 2 weeks. I learned the building science required to be an energy auditor for the low income or just any energy efficiency program in New York State. And then I got hired a couple weeks later. That's not a typical experience. We could talk about lots of that later. And I worked for a contractor, specifically in low income neighborhoods, specifically in newly settled immigrants. Anybody who had a complicated case was mine. And I learned so much about not just how the programs are supposed to work on paper, but then how they actually show up in the everyday lives of people and of construction companies and of people who don't like construction companies or do or whatever. So I have a lot of that experience that drove me to be part of the policy and solution side of this work. So I think that there are incredible positive aspects to the way that this work has been done previously. And I also think there are huge issues and gaps in the way that programs are rolled out and implemented. So working at Push Buffalo for the past 5 years, I got to work in a space called the New Economy space department it became, but in general, it's looking at the market and the economy that we see today and imagining what it could look like if it were designed for a different group of people than the financiers and engineers who tend to be in the room deciding how these things work. So I have a lot of experience in cultivating community development processes around trying to center the people impacted in the issue itself. And I think a lot of that, especially in an academic setting, comes back for me because a lot of that work is education and not patronizing education, like the kind of education where the engineer and the person who lives in the home are saying the same thing, but using different words. And if they dismiss each other completely, neither of them can do their job. But if you empower both of them to understand each other, you can come to new solutions kind of education. More like lifting people up and answering questions as they come than kind of a talking down to you and explaining kilowatt hours. So a lot of it is community, getting people together to talk about it, to learn about it, to be engaged. And then it's also demonstrating the projects that people don't think are going to work. So we worked in low-income housing tax credit projects to try to change the script on how extractive and generally terrifying those projects can be, to make them as substantive and community-oriented as we could push the envelope on, to prove that mandates and metrics needed to change in organizations like NYSERDA or larger funding organizations. We were often told by project officers, like, oh, that might not work. Can you show us it? Can you give us an example? And so we would go about trying to figure out how to demonstrate what these projects are. So a big piece of it was organizing, a big piece of that was demonstration, and then the third piece was policy. Because if you can do one-off solutions, one is never enough, but also teaches you a lot. And I have a lot to say about like why we need to fund the one-piece solutions. But if we're going to lift more ships than just that, we need to create policies and mandates and larger structures that allow this work to be holistic and not a one-off solution. And then 6 months ago, I left the harrowing and wonderful and complicated and weird world of nonprofits. And I came to the public sector, where I've been working at the Department of Energy on the state energy planning team for about 6 months. So this is my title disclaimer. I'm brand new. I don't know a lot about SEP yet, except for that SEP is the office that transitions funding from the federal government to states so that states can be their own little microcosms of energy efficiency, of however they want to move those forward. And my work, which really is scaling up the work that I've done in Buffalo to empower local residents to move forward projects that they want to do to the state level, which has been very interesting and also not something I'm going to be talking about a ton today. So if any of my states are listening or my colleagues are listening, I'd love to talk to you about it later, but I'm going to talk mostly about Push. What I did at Push doesn't necessarily reflect what I do today at the Department of Energy. but there's a lot of really good intersections. So today I'm excited to talk about markets and their many complexities, about the role of landlords, about energy efficiency metrics and how we used to measure them, and a lot of the weedy stuff that you get into when you don't have to define the problem endlessly because you've lived it some, which I'm very grateful to be in community with people who allow me to do that.
Okay, so just one-piece solutions. Just give an example of what you mean by one-piece solution.
So we interconnected the first 100% affordable community distributed solar array in New York State on the roof of a 53-unit LIHTC building. And it worked, but it was very small. And so for us, we learned everything we needed to learn to try to scale it up again. But going for funding after the fact, when people were less interested in small scale projects and they wanted you to have a fully fleshed out program, was a really hard battle to fight. So something I think about a lot is a quote by a guy named Jay Gould, I think. And I think about it in terms of innovation and how are we stimulating innovation. And he said, I'm paraphrasing, I'm going to get it wrong, but I'm much less interested in the weight and convolutions of Einstein's brain as I am in the idea that just as many of his equals died on cotton fields and in sweatshops across the United States. So I think there's a whole conversation to be had about if we don't seed those early phases for certain people who don't already have that infrastructure, they are never then able to get into the place where people call innovative and the place where people give people lots of funding and that world. So I think there's a really important distinction between like one-offs and the idea that they go nowhere versus what was learned from them and how do people really make something with that and give it traction in order to create real innovation.
Okay, that's
that was
great.
A long answer. I'm sorry.
No, that's perfect. Okay, so none of this has been rehearsed, so I don't know if we're going to wind up widely agreeing or have a kind of a food fight here. But Ariel talked about utilities best practices, so I'd like maybe her to give an example or two of what she would consider to be a utility best practice. And then we can get reactions from John and Sage as to what they like about it and what they feel has, if anything, has missed the mark.
Sure. And apologies, I think there's a lawnmower outside, so it might be a little loud. Yeah, there are a lot of different best practices that utilities are doing around energy affordability. And I will also say there's a lot more that they can be doing as well. I guess just for a tiny bit of background, right now, I think from the work that I do that most utilities, when they're looking to address issues of energy insecurity or energy affordability, they tend to invest in residential programs to reach low-income households. And these are often ratepayer funded, mandated at the state level. Sometimes they have financing programs such as on-bill financing, happy to talk more about that, or roundup programs or alternative rates to have lower rates for income qualified customers. I can talk more about best practices for those, which is what I focus on, but I'm also personally really interested in thinking more about how utilities can also be more equitable broadly outside of just low income programs. So how can they make sure that they are reaching households who may be income qualified with programs that aren't just for low income households? How are they making sure that community serving institutions, nonprofits, schools, within communities that have been excluded from funding historically are also being able to access these resources? So I think there's a lot of different things to think about. In terms of best practices for low income programs, it actually in the appendix of the energy burden report that I sent out, I have like a whole list of a bunch of different best practices, some of which that we've seen are some states have statewide programs that they coordinate so everyone in the state is able to access similar resources. So it's not only people who are in certain utility service territories. There are one-stop shop models, which I think are really great, where you'll have one nonprofit or one entity that can direct people towards all of the resources that are available so they can access them all at once. Some programs are able to leverage other funding, especially I think something I've been looking more into is leveraging funding from health sectors in particular to address some of the health and safety issues that may be in a home that may prevent the home from participating in a weatherization program, such as mold or a leaky roof or a trip or fall hazard. So I think being able to address those things and make sure people who need those improvements, as well as the weatherization, can benefit from all of these things at once. Yeah, I'll pause there. I'd love to hear more from both Sage and John.
So yeah, I just want to intervene just for a second,
Sure.
because I want to be sure that I've got this right. So when you said utility investments, these are not investments as we would normally think about a business making an investment, because what you talked about are programs that are funded by collections on utility bills, right? So this is not a business for the utility. This is something that the regulator has said we'll charge all customers and collect a pot of money and then give it to the utility to administer. Is that fair? Is that a fair way of describing it?
Yes, in most cases, most energy efficiency programs are ratepayer funded. There are some utilities that have Roundup. Roundup is not ratepayer funded, and some have in money from the utility that they spend on these programs, but most are ratepayer funded. And the programs that are ratepayer funded are regulated. So that means that the bodies that are doing the regulation, often the Public Utility Commission, can make decisions about where that money goes in certain ways.
Okay, so certainly one observation I guess we would make would be how much scale can really be obtained through these programs, because the effect is that the regulators are just I can imagine that there are certain advocates that are saying stop charging other customers more and more money to support lower income customers. I can imagine, because it has an upward effect on rates. I can imagine there being some criticism about that. But in any case, let me step out and have John and Sage react to what you've heard.
John, I can kick it off. Okay. So one of the two things. First, we used to do training all the time on how public utilities budgets work. And it's something, Richard, I know you know in detail, but even when you just boil it down and you make it a super simple explanation of the way that a public utility creates a social contract between the private and the publicness of a utility to then charge a certain amount of money to a group of people to supply a good. There's a specific formula to that really invests in capital investments and doesn't pay attention so much to how much energy is used. And that's a whole topic unto itself. But I just want to name that it is a conversation that I had with so many people, so many times, that helped people make sense of why the utility does what it does and how they do it. So I really encourage, there are a couple of trainings with Rocky Mountain Institute, several ones who just simplify the way that public utilities work. And I say that because, so one of the pieces, if you read public service law in New York State, in my experience, utilities have a social legal contract with the state that they may have monopoly control over a certain area as long as they meet X, Y, and Z requirements. And one of those major requirements is to supply energy to all with the ability to pay. And so right off the bat, the utility system is not designed for people who don't have the ability to pay, in a time when the ability to pay also then changes based on the cost of the good, the costs of the area, the way that economy is changing. And so a lot of my work revolved around fundamentally rejecting the idea that the system could possibly come in later and fix the problem, when one of the fundamental solutions was upstream in what if we design the grid around everybody has access to this because it is a common good, and then we figured out how to crunch the math around that to make it work. And I think part of why utilities have a hard time implementing these projects is because there's a mixed motive. So even working at a small construction company, their motive was largely to keep their roofers busy in the wintertime, to eat some overhead during the winter when they had nothing else to do. And so they invested in energy efficiency programs, and that met a lot of their needs. They were very successful with it, but it didn't mean that they were in it for the same reasons that we as a society need to be investing in low income energy efficiency work for all the reasons that we understand. And negotiating those mixed motives in that moment, there isn't a role for that. Regulators in theory do that, but they're so high above it that the actual rollout of the program implementation gets really complicated. And so I guess the short form of that is in a big dreamy future of the work that I used to do, rather than trying to perfect the individual programs, how do we change the larger system so that fewer of the programs have to exist? And meaning, like, where do the values shift from the beginning so that everybody having access is the goal? We address problems as they come up later down the stream. And I think the role of the utilities is changing drastically right now. Our relationships between public-private partnerships are changing in this country right now. And I think it's not nefarious as much as it is people just don't know how to navigate this new area. But I found that when you sit down with a bunch of people who experience these problems with the regulators and the financiers and the engineers, and you get them all to kind of talk about it, you can understand the problem much, much more directly than trying to come up with a solution based on data that is really hard to really see the whole thing. So that's a little bit on utility best practices and a place to sort of dig in and think about the system, I would say, is that initial public utility law, and what we do with that down the line.
Yeah, because I guess I'd observe that maybe some people think that there's a lot of money coming from the government, or some money coming from the government to deal with this problem, but it's not. These are not on budget expenditures or programs that are funded from government. I mean, they're funded. They're established through at least at the state level through state and local regulatory requirements, and whatever funding comes for these programs come from collections and surcharges on utility bills. So that's one structural element of the problem. So John, your thoughts?
Yeah, I think that this a lot had to do with, again, power and the way we obfuscate power. I think Sage just made it very clear, like, how utilities work. Their job is to make money. And I think we really need to just blow up this illusion of public-private partnerships and this idea that we can incentivize private corporations out of their own benefit. Because it's ridiculous and it doesn't actually work. It never has worked to do anything but to continue to inflate the value of their companies and the power that they have over our economy. So that's what a utility wants. They want to control the energy and economy in a way that produces the most revenue possible. They do that under a percentage structure, but it's very easy for them to hide. And if you look at most utilities, there's not just one company, right? They have multiple companies. All the corporations collectively under one umbrella take advantage of every single possible relationship to nonprofit, federal, other tax codes. And then programs are another thing. Like we need to stop creating programs, and we need to start identifying regions, areas, populations, people, because me personally, like, if I get an application and just a process on both sides of, like, filling out an application for weatherization, and Sage, like, knows this way more detail, but all of the ways in which that just produces barriers. And that's what a program is designed to do. It is not designed to work. It is designed to be efficient. And to be efficient means to give the least amount of money possible to the people that are theoretically in the most need. What it actually does is it just reduces the amount of benefit that is offered, because the utility, again, they don't want to give out all of their programmatic dollars, right? And then the programmatic dollars, as he said, are limited. So even if they were centered around giving them out, they'd be gone like that. And again, it's about process. So what the utility process does for low-income people is it produces utility debt. When you get behind in New York State on your electric bill, you pay 1.5% interest per month. Now, they'll constantly renegotiate to give you power, but they are also producing this debt balloon. So if you have a program that's worth $100 million and you have a process that produces $1 billion worth of debt, we need to take a step back and look and say that that's intentional. That is not a mistake. And we really also need to look at HEAP. So if we took the public utility debt for New York State, the amount of money that is paid in HEAP, and you just took that numerical number and looked at how to reorient a system that served the most people possible with the least barriers, to me, those orientations are what is going to produce a best practice. Other thing is these are private corporations. So, National Grid, 15% of their company is owned by hedge fund managers, and it has become a stash place for people's money. And that, again, is the stage of our economy that we're in, where the stability, utilities have the fact that they're allowed to be publicly traded and issue dividends, to me, is, again, ridiculous, because it says they could go into the market, they can issue more shares. There are all kinds of ways that a public utility can financialize its relationships to create more investments. Why is it that there is a tax that is essentially put on all users to provide for a program that is not nearly going to go to as many users that need it, while there is a process that produces this enormous weight of utility debt that keeps people in a trap of constantly raising that rate? And the number one goal is to get people of color to pay more, is to make that 43%. So once we create an association between these numbers, I think it's very simple how we reorient the process to meet people's needs.
Well, John, I'm going to push back on you a little bit, because I think that there is a problem related to the fact that that utilities run these things as programs, and I want to explore this issue of the documentation and how the money gets allocated, and not enough time spent with what people really want, enough time about the problem with the program design as being what kind of engineers think things ought to be, as opposed to the way it ought to really be. I think that's a fair criticism. Where I think that maybe I disagree with you on is that there is no financial incentive with respect to the programs for the utilities. The utilities are just running these things, and I think arguably, I don't know if it's the utility or some other third party, but if we're going to achieve scale, the question is, do we need to turn more of these activities into a business? Maybe not a business that's going to reinforce the power structures that you described, but maybe businesses that can be more controlled or owned by people in the community.
And I'll just say a quick response is, if the utilities are taking the money, then why do the utilities get to implement the money, right? If I'm sorry, not the utilities, if the regulators are taking the resources, the regulators should be then in a process with the people to decide how those resources are used, not giving the utility the decision-making over implementation. I think that's stage one of solving that large problem.
Okay, so that's good. So let's talk about, then let's go to this issue of how you might imagine these resources being spent differently, and what the problems are with, if there are expansion of talking about some of the issues that are associated with how programs are designed. How should they be designed?
Well, I'll let Sage start with that.
I want to hear what you have to say too. I think how should programs be designed? That's a big question. I would say my first thought is that if a program is really going to be effective, it is going to have to be done at least, you need to have local knowledge. So where would you like to make this change, at what scale? And before you dive in to come up with that solution, source information from that actual place and those actual people about what the problem really is to get your head around it. I think this is something we see very often in academic spaces, where it is easier to think with the data that you have available. It's easier to theorize about how this could change because it looks like something that you read about in another setting somewhere else that seems similar. And that is all super valid work, but I've never seen it be more impactful than just talking to people on the ground about what's going on there. So I think the first step is always create a process in which the community can be involved in the designing of the solution, not because it's like nice to have a photo op with like people in suits and like people not in suits and every color in between, but because that genuinely is going to get you the best result. And there are some people who believe that that gets you the result, and some people that don't. So I think there's a section there. But if you got people together and you were going to figure that out, I would say you'd need financiers, engineers, whoever the program officers are going to be, whoever the regulators are. You'd want landlords of variety of sizes, because a small landlord versus a large landlord versus a nonprofit, they all have different motives and different ways of talking about an issue that are going to come up in your program later if you don't address them, or at least consider them on the front end. You want to talk to renters, you want to talk to homeowners, you want to talk to people at different income brackets, you want to talk to people of different racial backgrounds, and try to figure out in a sort of Facebook, what is that, like move fast and break things kind of way, but like before you roll out the program, move fast and break things, and meeting people and trying to understand the problem. I think so. So I'm not going to say here's exactly how it should happen, because it starts with you have to make a process that then will roll out something that's going to happen. I think creating a program that has values of what you want to do, and then goals for tactics for how you're going to get there, and a reassessment time to go back and really look at to see if you're meeting that goal, and then creating those cycles throughout a program, which is what businesses do all the time, is something that would deeply benefit public programs. And I think that the thing that I can say concretely, though, is that marketing and sales don't work in low-income communities by definition, because it's not a marketing or sales problem. And when I was an energy auditor, I was really good at it, both in terms of getting people weatherized, but also making the company I worked for money, because I did case management, not just marketing and sales. And that meant that I was walking people through every step of the process and supporting them through when they couldn't find a document, or when they felt weird talking to the guy about the thing, because construction is a very traumatized space for a lot of people who have been hurt by contractors before. And that is what ended up delivering the best solutions, because my goal was help as many people as possible, which also resulted in the program running efficiently, because the company was already running a super high quality of install, a super effective test out problem. So I think in terms of service delivery, there's a lot from the private sector to keep, but like making anything that is even somewhat invested in by shareholders responsible for designing the program just scares me, not theologically, just like because I don't think they'll get the right answer, because you can't market to people who don't have money better to make them have more money.
So I don't understand. I don't completely understand what you mean by marketing and sales don't work. I understood what you did to help somebody. What do you mean by marketing and sales don't work?
So when I worked at Push, one of my first jobs there was to run a Solarize program. So if you're familiar with Solarize, it's the idea that if you aggregate the demand in a certain area for solar, which was still emerging at that time, you could get sort of a bulk price that would drive down cost. And my organization, before I got there, decided to make it specifically for low income, or targeted to low income, paired with energy efficiency. And so my job was to find people who needed energy efficiency solar, and then energy efficiency wanted solar, and then market solar to them and help advocate with them through the process to get solar on the roof from particular installers. And what we found is that it wasn't a matter of everybody thought going in, you just need to explain solar better to people, or they need to understand it, or they need to have confidence in the technology. And in reality, the way that the incentives were set up to be a tax credit for people who don't maybe have the best tax liability, or are afraid to get into a sticky situation with the IRS for reasons that are valid, or who don't have the ability to leverage 10 grand over a year before they get that tax return back. People who need their roof redone before they can get solar. I got a lot of people who ended up weatherizing, but their money went only as far as that before they could so they couldn't do solar, or they couldn't do these other things that needed to happen. So I think, I mean, I've never seen the mechanisms and instruments of the private sector that are marketing and sales solve the problem. Like I have seen case management, creating new programs that redirect resources to address problems upstream so that users can then solve other problems down the line as they need to, which is kind of the basis of energy efficiency. It's like if people aren't paying $500 for gas in the middle of the winter, maybe they can buy their kids coats more easily. And then their kids won't get as sick, and then they won't have the compounding issues that come from that. So I think there's a marketing and sales is about trying to get someone to buy a thing that has a value that you want them to know it has that value, in a sense. But when you're working in a space where there isn't money to buy that thing, the conversation becomes more about reorganizing resources, which is something that there is a particular skill set for that doesn't live necessarily in the private sector. Does that make sense?
I just want to expound on that most poor people are poor, and so in every single aspect of their life, they are bombarded with programs that are mostly mildly effective. So, that means you have a food stamp application, your kids go to school, they have a free lunch application, you're, on unemployment, you have to deal with Medicare, Medicaid, right? So like literally every aspect of their life is nothing but paperwork. And it feels like the first day you get a job, right? And you have to like fill everything out all the time. And then one thing I would love to be studied is like in banking, right? You study like originations versus applications. How often are people served by programs? I would argue that if all the applications that people do for programs, maybe a third of the time you get some benefit. And then what is the trade-off? What is the benefit that you're actually getting in return? So as a poor person, you really have no choice because you need to eat, you need the programs, you can't live without them. But the reality is the phrase and the term program is inherently off-putting to most people. Like nobody wants to be a part of a program because so often they don't work. And if they do work, they work at such a bare minimum level. It's that level of subsistence. And so people are not going to feel, even if you market to them about programs all day, what's going to tell someone to join a program is if it worked for someone else. And that's how communities work. So if you go to churches, if you go to anywhere where there's people who are socializing, there are going to be people in the communities that are going to run around and say, hey, I did this program and this program worked for me. And the second that happens and it works for another person, that information moves faster than any form of social media could ever reproduce. So I think, again, it's about understanding who is observing what you're doing. What do they see? What do they feel? What do they think about what you're doing? So that you can understand that if you want people to apply to your program because your program is 100% going to work for them, there's a way to figure that out without marketing to people, right? We know the political, we know the physical history of all of our spaces. If you took a map of any city, you can point exactly to the homes and to the places that are going to need weatherization. So why create a program? Identify that area. It's just they do it with opportunity zones. Trump did a great job of identifying spaces that he wanted to gentrify and incentivizing the benefits for the outcomes that he wanted to produce. And that's an old book, Empire Zones. Zoning around different financial relationships is something that developers and people in real estate are insanely good at. And I don't understand why it wouldn't be simple for a utility to identify the areas of lowest poverty, highest usage, and make those investments in a relationship with people that tells them up front, you are going to get this benefit. I often question if business people had to live the lives that poor people did, and they had to constantly put in applications knowing they full well were not going to get any benefit, they wouldn't do it. And yet poor people are constantly asked to put themselves and their information out there under the hope that they might get something because they have to. So marketing and advertising are frameworks, ideologies that are not going to work if you want your programs to be effective and to be relational to people. And it's really about, again, figuring out what is the social structure, where do people go, who knows who, and again, gentrification makes that more and more difficult because we have more and more transient populations. But again, thinking through the experience of the end user and what those outcomes are and working backwards to me are how these programs should be designed. And also to think about, during a tax reassessment, what does it mean if you're going to invest $50 million in a neighborhood? What is that going to mean for the neighborhood? What does that mean to the banking community in that neighborhood that has financialized all of those mortgages? And what does it mean to the owner class, right? To the gentry, to the people who are owning and renting homes to people. And so we have this level of incentive of thinking about how do we incentivize the utilities as a public-private partnership, but how are we incentivizing and holding accountable the landlord who says, I have no financial real interest in this. I'm just milking this property till I sell it. Why should I get weatherization? And so we're not trying to figure out how to get those people more engaged, which honestly is one of the biggest barriers to weatherizing homes that are not owner occupied is this, again, this way that things are financialized in a way that doesn't incentivize the outcomes we want. And at one level, at the highest level, we'll think of it that way, but at the lowest levels, we don't really think about how to incentivize real people's participation.
Okay, good. So Ariel, so a couple of things have come up, and I'm also monitoring all the questions that we have. So maybe we can turn to a couple things. One is you mentioned the issue of health, and another possibility of some resources coming from what's not just from utility bills, but from expenditures that may be spent on people's health. So one of the questions that I think people might have is if you weatherize a home, are you making it, sealing it up, are you making it more healthy or less healthy? And maybe you can talk a little bit more about the connection between weatherization and health.
Sure. I also have a couple of thoughts in the last part, but we'll move on to this.
No, you please follow up
Okay.
on that, and then we'll talk to that.
Okay. One thing I just wanted to add on to what Sage was saying, which I think is really great, and what John was saying about designing programs to meet the needs of the community rather than trying to fit a community into a designed program, is that I think another best practice is for utilities to value and monetarily value the time and input that community members are putting into these processes as well. Because if you're trying to have a program reach a certain community, then the people in that community have the expertise that you need to have that happen successfully. And that should be valued monetarily. And then also just wanted to mention the idea of energy democracy as well, which is shifting power back to communities to make decisions about the energy system that's, affecting them. So I think, ways that within these processes to design programs, that power can be shifted to the community as well to have accountability and to be able to have influence into what the outcomes look like, I think is really important. To move on to the health question, weatherization does seal buildings more tightly, but they also should be well ventilated. And also health issues that may be in the building already, such as mold or asbestos or other things that could make you unhealthy, should be mitigated before weatherization as well, so that the building can be sealed tightly and made into a healthy environment. There's a ton of information on this that's out there for people interested. But there's been a lot of studies that have found that weatherization, along with that, addressing the health impacts of buildings can lead to people having less cases of respiratory diseases such as asthma. It can help people also live in just safer homes. A lot of times, if the building isn't weatherized to the right level, you'll live in a building that's way too cold or way too hot, which can lead to very negative outcomes in the summer and winter. So in terms of health and weatherization, they're really intricately tied. And within the energy efficiency sector, there is more of a focus now too on finding ways to kind of put resources together that are trying to address both of these problems so that it can be addressed together. So there are some programs that are beginning to look at ways to leverage Medicaid dollars to go into people's homes who are often experiencing health impacts that are due to the inefficiency or the unhealthiness of their home, and weatherize that home as a way to help address healthcare needs. So I think this is one way that efficiency is beginning to move forward, and one way to maybe leverage additional dollars to address the benefit that comes from weatherization in the health sector, as well as other benefits as well.
So is that something that can be done at the state level, or is that something that requires the feds?
Oh, that's a good question. There are some state pilot programs in a few different states. I'm not quite as familiar with them. I think it is something that at the federal level is beginning to be looked into more, ways to kind of to leverage those different funding sources.
Okay. All right, that's I know New York State has one of these
They do,
pilots.
yeah.
All right, so you use the word dollars. So we've been talking a lot about dollars. So I think we should talk about financing, and there have been a couple of questions from the audience about financing kind of questions, including PACE. So who wants to talk about the role of financing of these in terms of how difficult it is to get financing for projects?
Don't all jump off at once.
Thought you were going to say something. I think that I guess I'll just start with one, there has to be a project. And so the idea that, developers, when they have to do a project, they have the capital that they've built up of all of the other projects. They have relationships. There is an entire economy and system, designed around for-profit enterprises. And when it comes to dealing with folks in the community and benefits that don't actually produce more capital, this kind of chicken and egg of how do you pay the people that create the project and then have to bake into paying for those people into the project. And then this enormous gap in understanding. Again, I believe everyone can understand everything, but the reality is if you go to school to be an urban planner, if you go to school to be an engineer, if all you think about all day is how to design buildings and systems, and you come into a community that is actually a system designed to limit the ability to acquire capital and have power in society, that particular group of people, it's incredibly difficult to balance those things out. So I think, again, just like programs, projects, these singular, again, there's a timeline, there's an end date, and politicians love cutting the ribbons on projects. But again, I think the central problem is creating a more holistic approach of like, what are the needs and how do we have a plan where each project is in a larger framework that addresses some of these other things. So I think like even and then you have to make them financeable. There's a set of values. There are like things that are just have to be done in order for a project to be financially viable. And most of those things have no relationship to people's benefits or producing the most outcomes. So I think it's a problematic process. I think other folks can get more into the details, but I just think that I think we need to take a step back and actually work with communities to plan them out, to think about what sets of projects, what kinds of projects, and what ways we can work through these complex sets of interactions that it takes to produce a project that actually engages community and helps them think about the future of their community in a way that they probably never have, because most communities have just gotten worse. And then even if they've gotten visually better, the dynamics and the intensity has gotten worse. So I think that's where the problem starts. And then of course, budgets and the politics of how things are funded initially to even get to the program level, then make everything else after that very difficult.
Well, I guess maybe to follow up here, because I asked such a general question. I mean, I'm thinking again, back to what we talked about earlier. I guess I'm thinking about somebody owns their house. Okay. And John, to your point that if the house has improvements that are being made to the house, will somebody be able to hold on to the house, or will they wind up losing it because maybe they get a tax reassessment or something like that? So leaving the tax reassessment aside just for a moment, which would be a separate issue, for those people that own their homes, if they happen to live in a place where it's very energy inefficient, it's very possible that the project itself could be economic, right? The savings could pay for the investment. And so then the question would be, is it possible? How difficult is it for that homeowner to get financing for that project? The PACE question that somebody asked from the audience, is a good question. The challenge is that, PACE isn't really available for residential customers. So that's one of the problems with PACE. But just wondered in general your perspective, if anybody has any perspectives on this category of opportunity, as to whether or not you could even get financing, even if you own your own home, and even if there's a project that would pay for itself, and whether there's anybody in the private sector that's trying to step in to fill this problem.
I mean, one of the big pieces there is that you're combining housing financial mechanisms with energy financial mechanisms. And there is, in my experience, rarely good communication between the two. If you're looking at it from a financial lens, but if you're living in your home, it's all the same. And so I think, I've seen weatherization programs through NYSERDA's assisted home performance programs, through Empower, where I got to walk into a house, do a write-up, the crews came out, they weatherized the entire thing. They did a really good job on it. I tested it out. I made sure the air changes were good so that it wasn't too tight. We didn't do work in there if there was a roof leak because we didn't want to create mold. And we left, and a family had 30 years of an energy efficient wall assembly and roof attics line for free because they qualified in this particular bracket. There were also a ton of houses I walked into where someone had a plumbing leak in the basement. And so I couldn't do, even if they qualified, I couldn't do their energy efficiency. Or a roofs are huge. I mean, if you think structurally about in a redlining world, and even a post redlining world, who could afford a roof loan? Like, you have already cut out so many people who would be great candidates for energy efficiency, and the energy efficiency world is not interested in taking on the risk of figuring out roofs in addition to what they're already doing. Or I would have people who were the perfect case for it, but made $10 too much. And so they couldn't qualify for it, but they could qualify for the middle income program, which was a 50% subsidy. And sometimes that would work, but most of the times, even the $3,000 you would need to do a new furnace, et cetera, was more than a family would have available at that time. So I think there's one of the big pieces is that the negotiation between housing and energy is not clear in terms of like the financiers, et cetera, that then trickles down to the people who are trying to make these programs work together without their mortgage that ties in the taxes, because it's like a way of de-risking the mortgage version of it then go up just because someone's house got reassessed, et cetera. I would say most of this revolves around risk and how to underwrite risk in a world of uncertainty, where the people who are being assessed for risk are often being assessed by people who deeply do not understand those people, not because they're bad it's not their fault that they don't understand those people. I haven't met a lot of people who do underwriting who often speak directly with cohorts of people who they're trying to create these programs for. And I think that would be a really good way to shift the way that we understand risk as a society so that we can make these projects work. I think oftentimes the payback period being a year, or being a political cycle, or being all of these externalities, as opposed to what is actually the physics of the problem in terms of payback periods, and also the long-term economic plan for an area. Like John said, community planning is really important. If you're going to say, like, the city of Pittsburgh wants to not have any unweatherized housing in 15 years, you can make that plan, and you can plan around that outcome, but you can't do that in 2 years. Maybe 15 years is not even enough, but like you need enough time to really address the problem at hand. And I think I appreciate, Ariel, you bringing up energy democracy, because I think that is a big piece of this. Richard, I know you've made the point before that, like, do we really want politicians to be deciding who gets their energy shut off? And I agree. I don't know a lot of politicians that I would want to make a nitty-gritty program decision. But I also don't know if I want a 25-year-old engineer who's analyzing data for the first time after grad school to decide which neighborhood is the best to do X investments in. And so what is a future in which the dynamic elements of, you run a program for a year and you see how many people got bounced out for which reasons, and someone with the understanding and with the connections who was elected or appointed or something to specifically do whatever this thing is called. Like we have police chiefs in cities. Are we going to need equity chiefs who are charged with bringing forth these outcomes in an informed and dynamic way? I think that would make a huge difference. And then the last thing I'll say on this is just data. If I had access to every utility data when I was trying to figure out how to prove that a project was scalable without needing to wait 5 years for a utility to give me their proprietary information, et cetera, I could have, not just me, but me and my colleagues could have done so much more work. But because it's a proprietary piece of information, it's really hard. I also see programs that are designed with just utility data, but what you're not seeing is all of the people who don't use as much energy because they don't want to get shut off. And so that's seen as the full amount. But in reality, people are just going really cold and suffering from that because they can't even afford to use as much energy as they would have. Or all of the details of like the economy that exists under the real economy, that is also a real economy, are usually the things that also get bounced out of the programs that are designed, because whoever was designing them wasn't looking at those things, which is a logical problem, but also one that if we don't fix, we're just going to run into the same issues. So that was a long answer.
No, that's good. So, Ariel, I just want to
just the one thing on pace, I'll say really quickly, and is I won't say too much on it, but just any moment where you're trying to negotiate taxes and homeownership with energy efficiency upgrades, the argument that ensues is mostly between banks, and you would need someone who can have a conversation and come to a solution there, rather than trying to redesign the program to be maybe better within those constraints is one approach that we used to take at Push. So,
okay, John, do you want to say something?
Yeah, just quickly want to say that when we talk about risk, I want to be explicit that risk is racist. It's a racist framework that is designed to reward privilege. So when we're talking about assessing risk, we're basically saying like, how do we reward the people that have the most already? And I think that it requires us talking to more banks and using some of the state's leverage and power it has in its work with banks to bring into these conversations as a stakeholder if we're going to address financialization.
All right, so we've only got about 15 minutes left. So I wanted to turn to sort of a combination of things, kind of open-ended, but I think you've made the case very much about a whole series of problems associated with things being top-down as opposed to being more bottoms-up. And so I want to kind of explore this question about what's the proper role of regulation, and what's the proper role of federal, state, and local? Because Sage, you just talked about City of Pittsburgh, and New York City's got an aggressive laws. So Ariel, I'll start with you. What's your how do we think about all that?
In terms of advancing a more just energy system?
Yes.
Yeah. I think there's plenty of policies that can be enacted at the federal, state, local level and for regulation that can help address some of these issues that we're seeing. Recently, I've been thinking about regulation, and let's see. And also I'll say, like, there's a lot of models that are happening in different states and in different communities now. And there's also a lot more that can be done beyond what we're currently seeing too. So this is just kind of, the beginning of what can be done. But in terms of regulation, we're seeing some states One big barrier that I see is the cost effectiveness tests of energy efficiency programs, and which tests are being used to decide if a program is worth running or able to be run, so that it is bringing in more benefits than the cost of the program. And some states are beginning to incorporate more of the benefits of these programs. So some of these health benefits, community benefits, economic benefits, when they're making these assessments of if energy efficiency is a worthwhile investment. And for a lot of low-income programs, state regulation around that is different. So they'll either waive those requirements or have adders or ways to kind of account for some of those benefits. So I think that's one thing regulators can do to better incorporate the value of energy efficiency in terms of advancing energy justice. Some states are beginning to do different types of working groups where they're trying to make regulation with communities or groups that represent communities at the table, which is good. As well as, let me see, I think another thing that's been brought up, I think Sage, you brought this up also, is the difficulty of data and how we really need more data as well in order to know, in order to hold regulators, utilities, states accountable to the commitments that they're making as well. So I think regulators can also do more to require the collection of different data, such as demographic data or data on who's participating in programs, so we can have a better idea of what these disparities look like. Because right now, a lot of utilities don't report on information about who is participating in different programs. And even within a low-income program, which communities are having access and which aren't. So there's a lot of gaps there that aren't necessarily being measured as well. At the state and local level, we're seeing a lot of policies and plans, especially around climate action, coming into place. And I think there's a lot more that can be done both at the state and local level to make sure that communities are involved within those processes, to make sure that jobs that are created from investments in programs are local, and you're training people within the communities that you're investing in as well, so that you're addressing some of these intersectional issues as we've been talking about as well. So you're building wealth within communities and not just providing a program, you're also building up wealth within the community. So happy to talk more, but I'll pass it to John or Sage if you want to add.
John, you want to
go? Yeah, I think all of that was really powerful. I think with energy efficiency, again, it's really, to me, like identifying who needs what, where, and how they are going to best be able to receive it and hold it, and mitigating any of those future impacts, and then making it something that I think getting more into the emotional relationships that feels good to people, right? No one feels good filling out an application, which is a central reason even well-designed programs don't work. So what are other ways of communicating with people? And I think that in the private market, especially in our technologically advanced world today, there are so many ways that people are engaging with people, finding out information about what they want. Some of them are pretty creepy, but I think that we can find some real ways to engage people, get the information we need from them, and figure out how to serve them in a fundamentally different way. And I think ultimately that leads to people seeing their relationship to energy, housing, and other things differently, which then lays a foundation for us to be able to plan with folks, and for folks to start to also create more feedback loops that can help increase the understanding we have of how these relationships actually impact people. And I think that, again, making it feel good, making it feel right, making it something that people actually want to do and participate in, instead of seeing none of themselves in. And I think, yeah, we need to serve people. Like, we need to be able to show this person got this service, it worked for them, it worked for the planet. And I think a lot of that also has to deal with the way in which the decisions at every layer of government need to draw decisions down to a lower layer, and then ultimately to people. So federal government should create funding mechanisms and structures because of its ability to leverage money in different ways that are based on the requests of people on the ground. And every layer of government really should be just kind of putting together the piece of the puzzle. Municipalities and counties should be working with their residents to bring that up. They should be summarizing that and sending that up to the state. The state plan is really just a conglomeration of all of the individual community plans, that those state plans going up to the federal government and thinking, okay, we have all of these little plans, we've regionally assessed them, and then how do we like practically bring them back down? Again, not with total decision making, but in relationship with the people on the ground in the ways that make the most sense. So to me, government is supposed to be facilitating, not directing, not dictating, and not defining.
I love this question about regulators because I think it's such an important piece of all of this. We are trying to build a new grid for a new energy future. And the grid that we previously had and the regulation system that we previously had was for a different grid with a different projected energy future. And so when I was working at Push, I thought a lot about what needs to, that both need to change at the same time. I think one of the big barriers, or one of the biggest topics of discussion in the energy world and energy efficiency world, is the tension between regulators and markets. And this is something across the US right now, where regulations are bad and markets are good. But then when markets fail, what do we do? And so I think a piece of this is trying to pilot new relationships wherein regulators are seen as a part to help bring about the same end goal as all parties involved, and creating spaces where that tension is channeled towards problem solving, not bitter rate case battles about whatever, which we've all seen before. And we know that we know how that theatrical play of a rate case plays out. And for me personally, when I was doing this work, never saw myself in that process when the impacts of the end of a rate case really did change things in my life. And so I think just in general, we need new regulation systems. We need regulators who are committed to particular goals that need to be decided by values, and then markets work in line with those values, which is very hard to do. So that's my fun homework for you, Richard. But I think the other thing I want to say too is just like, we've seen, like airlines are an example. Airlines 35 years ago are similar, I think, Richard, you've said this before, to the energy market today in terms of how resource heavy they are. They're designed to operate at peak capacity. And then a lot of work was put into sort of leaning them out and making them a totally different industry that operates much more efficiently. Doing that today with energy, I think is complicated, and a good example of that is that when COVID hit, the airline algorithms did not have any idea what to do with human behavior during a pandemic. And so that's why prices went down so low. The algorithm said, nobody's buying anything, we'll drop prices, that will make people buy things. People continue to not buy things. And so the algorithm just kept lowering and lowering and lowering prices until there was super, super cheap flights. And the airlines actually had to come in and change the algorithms based on a value-based judgment to say, are we going to price gouge right now? No, that's terrible for our PR. What do we do? What is that middle ground? And I think that is something that we've seen before, that we know is going to happen, and that those issues are things that we can prepare for, rather than just trusting that a market is going to be perfect on its own. And to me, that is a role that either a regulator or an elected official or a climate chief or somebody who not only is making mandates and goals for other people to follow, but who's helping make that direct decision in the moment can be part of.
Okay, so we've got just a few minutes left. And so I've got 2 questions for each of you. And these are going to be fill in the sentence questions, okay? So let's start with you, John. So 1 sentence here, okay? Less Faulkner, more John, okay? The toughest lesson that I learned working on this problem is, or was, toughest lesson I learned working on this problem was?
I had to work with engineers, scientists, and other people of major privilege on understanding the realities of everyday community life, and that had to be done at scale.
All right, that's great. All right, Ariel, what keeps me going is?
That's a great question. What keeps me going is all of the positive solutions I see, especially at the local level, within cities, within communities, to fight for a more just energy system in future.
All right, Sage. One thing I wish people knew on this webinar would remember is?
That being in relationship with people who are impacted by the problems that you are trying to understand is the best research you could possibly do.
Ariel, the advice, and you guys can expand on these questions as much as you'd like. The advice I'd give to a student who wants to work in this area is?
My advice is that I've seen that data on injustices can be really important to moving policy and moving policymakers. I've seen from the energy burden reports that ACEEE has done, I've seen them often cited and used by advocates and policymakers to move for programs to address the inequities. So I would say, the more research that can be done to paint a picture that, people who live within communities experiencing energy insecurity already know this. But sometimes I think data can help push policymakers who maybe see the world a little differently, as well as stories. So qualitative and quantitative research, I think, can both be really powerful to help influence policy.
All right, Sage, the one thing that people on this webinar can do is?
In order to what?
Work on this problem.
Take a good hard look at yourself or your community and the work that you do, and examine whether, and if there are not people who don't look like you or people who you are not trying to address the problems of in the room with you, feeling comfortable and empowered to be there and be part of the solutions, you should stop chasing your tail and figure out a way to make a process that doesn't look like that.
All right, John, you're going to get the last word here. It would be good if CJEP could.
It would be good if CJEP could work on a racial equity assessment of energy efficiency programming that included the ability for people who've received these benefits to express like how they've received them. It would be good if we could, in policy and research in general, do more work to understand the problems that we're not understanding and produce data, numerical, and even theoretical relationships, but like a groundwork for what we're saying. We've put out a lot of information about it, but I think actually people need, to be walked through like how to relate to communities and to be a leader in advocating and setting the standard for other research groups. That being community-centered is actually the most important way that we solve all of these problems. And I hope that this is step one to doing that.
All right, so with that, what a great conversation. I would just scratch the surface here. So I want to thank you again, for attending and to our speakers for joining us today. As we've mentioned, the full video recording of this event will be available on our website in a few days. Our next event, Geopolitical Outlook 2020-2021, will be held this Thursday, October 29th at noon Eastern Time. And for a full calendar of events, please visit us online. Thank you all again and enjoy the rest of your day.